I didn't know this was going to be a family reunion, but it's good to see all the friends of the foundation here. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Tony, for being on the board and for this presentation. It has been a fantastic journey coming to Nigeria regularly here and see how the country has developed. The first time I was in Nigeria was 10 years ago, and I think a lot of the presentation you see today reflects a lot what also happened in Nigeria. But let me just start with talking a bit about what has happened in the development sector. In my view, the last 10 years has been extraordinary. In 1990, as you know, we saw the fall of the communist system, and I think many of us felt that was a very, very big decade. In my view, the 2000 decade, from 2000 to 2010, has actually been a bigger decade for the world. And you can say, why so? Well, if you think about it, 10 years ago, when we started this Dalberg, Africa would be seen as a continent of recipients of aid. That's more or less how the continent was cast. Today, 50% of the world's output is being created in the South, so non-OECD countries. That's very, very significant. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of the growth in the world today is happening in the South. Historically, if you go back, not more than 300 years, but even if you go back to the time of Jesus Christ, you will see that the global GDP were distributed where 80%, between 70 and 80%, belong to the South, if we include India and China in the South, and only 20 to 30% in the North. So what is happening in this decade is really that we are seeing a shift in perhaps 10, 20 years from how the world were as a normal state back to that position again. One of my friends, I think he has a very good way of looking at it. He say, every time we have a 1 BRIC year, but every time we have one OECD year, we basically have 5 BRIC years, meaning if you look at the growth rates we have today, we're seeing that in the OECD countries we have between 1 to 2% growth, while in the non-OECD countries we basically have between 7 and 9% growth in many places. So that has changed dramatically how the world looks like. What this presentation is going to show you is our view upon what have been the underlying drivers of this. Because most people will say, well, it's the capitalistic system, it's trade, etc. But there's something that have enabled the South, the developing countries, to get to this stage. And that's what this is about. If we look upon our own company, then we were set up 10 years ago. And at that point in time, we ourselves were very much locked into this perspective about aid, where it was very much about public sector aid. What had happened since then is that there's been a big shift, that today a lot of the development discourse is about private sector opportunity. 1 minute on our own company is that we were started 10 years ago, we have 10 offices around the world, and I think what differentiates us to many of the other players out there is that, one, we are what you call a blended capital value firm, or a social enterprise, meaning our objective function is not earning a lot of money. Our objective function is to have a development impact. And there's a lot of people that have quit jobs at Wall Street or some of the leading consulting firms and take significant salary cuts to make sure that every day they wake up in the morning, they're doing something meaningful. And the second thing I think that characterized our firm is the fact that we are only working on development issues and global issues, nothing else. And there's good reason for that, because it's very, very difficult. So if you one day are working on optimizing dog food, and the next day you're advising a minister about how to fix his finances, you're not going to be a specialist. And what we wanted to make sure was that we really understood this complex world that the development space is. If you look upon the last 10 years, you'll see a lot of positive and negative information, what have really happened. I tried to just sample a few of them. So on the positive side, we have seen a lot of positive social development in the world, particularly in Africa. Whether it's around child mortality, it's around aid flows going up and so forth. We've also seen a lot of negative things. And I think the energy crisis, the food crisis, the climate crisis, terrorism and so on are showing us a picture that the world is still not the best place to be. However, overall, it's a very positive story. Many of you will know the MDGs. Here's a snapshot of some of them. And what you will see is that Sub-Saharan Africa, that many people in 2000, when this was created, was writing off and saying Sub-Saharan Africa is not going to be yellow and green. Today, actually, it's getting there. What you're also seeing is that on the economic side, there's been growth in some of the key countries and has translated into social progress. There was another concern. Another concern was, yes, we will see growth, but we only for the few. What has underpinned it has been a lot of financial flows into developing countries. And as you can see, development aid has by far not been the most important source. So, in order for us to figure out what are these key interventions that really have made a difference, we try to create a framework to think about it. It's obviously a very difficult exercise to figure out what is it that have made the biggest difference. And if you look at this chart here, it's a chart I use quite often. It basically shows the type of interventions you can see in the sector. There are different interventions that are either driven by the private sector, driven by the public sector, and the recipient are either the public sector or the private sector. This chart here is from a report we did back in time, and we helped with on private sector development. But it captures pretty well the kind of interventions that exist. And what we've seen over the last decade is basically a move from the public to public space into the private to private space. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in a few minutes. But if you take the historical view on this, then what you're seeing is that in the beginning, we very much had a paradigm after the Second World War where it was a public to public paradigm. It was about the Marshall Plan, it was about Europe, it was the US government and the UK government that are driving on this. The Bretton Woods institutions were established. Later on, we get into still the same paradigm, but where it's the World Bank that are driving a lot of these things in terms of structural adjustment programs, in terms of different development paradigms that was fairly ideological because it was overshadowed by the Cold War. Later on, we saw that debt forgiveness was a big thing because a lot of these countries were full of debt. And we start seeing that the American foundations, particularly Melinda and Bill Foundation, were created and start providing new sources of capital. In the 2000s, we have seen a wealth of new interventions that has shaped this industry. And the players here have been a mix of international organizations, private foundations, private companies and so forth, that have found different ways of contributing. When we're trying to figure out, so what are those 10 interventions for the last 10 years, we try to go around it in a fairly systematic way. And it's of course very difficult to find out what is it that has moved the needle the most. And is it, wait, let me just go back. Is it things that are directly targeting the poor people at the bottom about survival? Is that what's made the biggest difference? Is it the short-term things, it's about getting education right and so forth? Or is it more around creating a diversified economy? So to find out what were the interventions that really made a difference, together with my colleagues, we went through a very short exercise. We said, let's look upon the different sectors where we have seen big progress. In economic terms, in social terms, in environmental terms. Let's shortlist them, and then in the end find out which one have made a lot of difference in terms of life expectancy, life quality, and have been cost efficient. So we came up with this list. This list as you can see, is very much targeted in the private quadrant. It consists of bottom of the pyramid, which I'm sure many of you have heard about from Prahalat. It's about mobile phones. I'm sure here in Africa you appreciate what happened on the mobile phone front. It's about aid transparency, large-scale HIV programs. It's doing business. It's direct budget support. It's competitiveness. It's microfinance. It's Chinese aid, and it's remittances. I'll now take you through each one of those, and afterwards we'll get into the 5 ones that I think is going to shape the development sector going forward. If we look at the bottom of the pyramid, the person that took leadership in that was C.K. Prahalat and Stuart Hart. And the fundamental premise was that a lot of poor people out there are being seen as victims, as beneficiaries, but in reality, they're also consumers, they're also entrepreneurs, they're also producers. And we need to rethink how we look upon those opportunities. And what we've seen is that there's been a lot of folks around, companies from the North multinationals coming in and creating local supply chains. But in reality, the big scoop around bottom of the pyramid is that we've seen large national companies, particularly from Africa and India, that are creating new services and products tailored to the middle class and below that has grown exponentially fast, particularly in banking and particularly in IT. And in India, we see it very much in the consumer side. So if you look at the numbers right now, we did a study around the sub-Saharan African multinationals, and from 2006 to 2009, they increased the revenue by 28.7%. If you go to the next page, then we look at the mobile phone area. And the mobile phone area as well is an intervention that fundamentally has changed the space. And the reason it's changed so dramatically the space is that we have basically flattened the world. So we are today in a situation where 5 billion people have a mobile handset or access to one. That means that people that before was in rural areas that had to spend a lot of time to get into cities and so on to be connected, now they can simply do it by having a mobile phone. And if you look at Kenya's economy today, then they estimate around 20% of the economy of GDP is cashless today. It's a huge breakthrough. I have some interesting numbers in terms of how fast this is going. So, if we look upon Kenya, they created Safaricom created an application called M-Pesa, and during the first months, they got 1 million new users, and today it has 10 million users. In 2000, 10% of the Kenyans had a bank account. Today, 80% of the Kenyans have access to mobile technology. They estimate around 14 million people today are mobile banking users in Kenya. So there's been a lot of hype about mobile banking, but there's also been some criticism. And one of the critical points have been that there's still very few countries that are using mobile technology productively. And we're still seeing very, very few services. It's still the same stories we're hearing over and over again. If we go to aid transparency and impact evaluations, then that is an area that as well has shaped the industry quite significantly. And the reason is that we have not until the 2000s seen effective ways of designing public policies and evaluate and learning from them and then redesigning them and take decisions upon it. That has clearly happened during the last 10 years. We have seen that a lot of the governments that have had big success have created delivery units, they create performance management systems, they have kept the civil servants accountable, the political leaders accountable for delivery. if you look at an interesting example that I often use, and that's not procurement. We know from the OECD countries that if you do efficient and effective public procurement, you can basically save between 5 and 10% of your procurement cost. If you look at a country like Nigeria, imagine if you can save 10% of public budgets on procurement. It's a huge amount. I mean, I just looked up, the government of Nigeria has a budget around $10 billion. I don't know how much of that is public procurement. But the development dividend of introducing transparency and introducing good governance reforms are very, very significant. One of the issues around aid transparency is the fact that we still have very few development standards. So learning from one country, one project to another one has been very, very difficult. There was a study by ILO where they looked at 280 different programs, and they had to conclude that only 2 of them they could actually create standards that could be rolled out for other projects going forward. If you go to the next one, which is the HIV area. HIV is one of the areas that I think, broadly speaking, has been seen as the most successful area in development in terms of reducing health risks. In 2001, we had $1.6 billion going into this field. Today, it's close to 16 billion. It's tenfold in a matter of 10 years. You can see that in the beginning of the 1990s, basically in a country like Uganda, 30% of pregnant women had HIV. Today, it's 5.6%. If you look upon a country like Rwanda today, 88% of people that have HIV are now in treatment. The cost of treatment has gone from 140 in the early stage, from 10,000 in 2000 to around 140 in 2009. It's dramatic changes. There's of course been some criticism as well about this area, and one of the critical points is that too much money has been put in this area. At the end of the day, yes, there's a lot of people that are dying for HIV, but if you look at malnutrition, if you look at malaria, the death tolls are much, much higher. And secondly, if you look at it from a health care perspective, the HIV money has basically created parallel systems, particularly in Africa. So what you have today is private clinics that are treating everything else but HIV, and people are paying a fee for it often. And you basically have free systems that are only focusing on HIV. So we create some structural problems in terms of the healthcare systems in Africa, given this amount of money that's coming into the HIV problem. If you look at the next area, which is direct budget support and basket funding, it's an area as well that has quite significantly changed the picture. What it is basically a way for donor governments to put in money into recipient governments, so they themselves manage the money. It's their system, they're accountable, and so forth. And there's good reason for that. So if you, for instance, think about a country like Mozambique, where I visited them, 5-6 years ago, the government, every time they had to launch a new donor program, they would have approximately 22 donors involved, because there were 22 donors active in the country, and each of them had their own reporting standards, their own objectives, and it was very, very difficult for the government to create any efficient government programs that were sponsored by donors. What the direct budget support also is doing is basically create internal capacity by basically saying, by you getting this kind of amount, we expect you to have certain standards. And I'll give you an example of a country in the Caribbean that I was also visiting. And they were in the process of negotiating an IMF loan. And IMF came to the island, and they sent 4 PhDs from Harvard, MIT, Stanford, what have you, to negotiate with the government. And the Minister of Finance himself, I think he had master's degrees, and the 2 people he brought in had both, one had a bachelor degree in finance, the other had not even agreed in finance. and they were supposed to kind of negotiate with IMF. You know, you need to create smart governance, you need to create capacity, and that's what direct budget support has done. One of the other benefits it's done is basically have enabled local governments to create a real tax base. So if you went back 10 years ago and looked upon the amount of taxes countries they're collecting versus today, there's been a huge change in terms of the uptake of tax revenues. In most developing countries today, aid is a small fraction of the government income. And I think direct budget support has been part of building those tax systems that has enabled this. One of the criticisms of direct budget support is that it basically creates another side of dependency, because suddenly the government is very dependent on these kind of funds, and if they go down, immediately they see a result in their own expenditures. Now I'll come to the next one, which is doing business and formalization. This has been an area that has also had a lot of attention over the last decade. There's basically two pieces in this. The first one is around formalization, which is an area that has been headed up by Henrik Skovby. And his point is basically because very large amounts of the developing countries' economies are informal. In certain countries, we're talking about 70% to 80% of the entire workforce working in the informal sector. Because these economies are so dependent on the informal sector, it's going to be very, very hard to build sustaining, growing businesses because you can't find collateral. So his argumentation is you need to create reforms that enables people to get their property rights. The other part is the Doing Business report from the World Bank, which basically ranks countries from the top to the bottom in terms of how ready and how good they are in serving the private sector. And it's been quite significant in terms of the progress that has been made. So for instance, 2003, where the report was launched, you have seen 270 business regulations in different countries. You've seen, for instance, a country like Ghana that had a process of registering land properties that took 3 years. Today, it takes 5 years. Today, it takes 34 days. Some of the criticisms that we've seen in terms of the doing business formalization have been that, one, Henrik Skovby has been very much focusing on only protecting ownership, but in reality we know that it's equally important to think about good regulation and think about social security networks. Another thing is that doing business has become a checklist. It's become a technical checklist where governments start going down and say, we now know what criteria matters, and let's make sure we hit them. And in reality, what's more important is that you create a good environment for building competitive business. So we'll ask you to pay 12%. Well, so that's how the world problem looks in a very simplistic way today. So now we create a new system. We have a guy over here, still the same. There's the same guy over here as well. Now what happens is, we have to get a boost, and I will borrow it to you for 6% because I like your idea. But you over here, that's sports car, it's not really my style, so we give you 15%. Now what happens is, we have removed the bank's ability to kind of say how much should this standard product look like and how much this smaller standard product look like, to a one-to-one connection. What's interesting is that a person over here may say, listen, I'm also interested in this guy. I think it's a good idea. I'm also willing to do 6%. I think that is great. Now, what happens is a third person comes in. He says, I need $1,000. This guy says, I'll give you 500. This guy says, I'll give you 500. The third person comes in and says, I also want to give 500. Now he's oversubscribed.
So then the bidding process goes on. This guy says, I'll give you to 5%. Now, this may sound futuristic, but it's actually happening today. So if you go to websites like kiva.com, kiva.org, or you go to myC4, it actually happens today. It happens in very small scale. But in the future, I think these kind of products here are going to explode. I'm not saying it's going to be as dramatic as innovative financing at all, but I think it's interesting for people sitting in your shoes to think about your own business and what's happening in mobile banking today, and what's happening in terms of people having preferences for actually knowing who they're borrowing to and creating new relationships. The world, I think, is changing dramatically in terms of we thinking it's going to be pyramids where everything's really fine. I think the world's getting flat now, and we want to be controlled in another way because now we've been empowered. And that brings me to the last presentation, the last idea. Seeing is, as you all know, we're seeing right now in Northern Africa, we see in the US, UK, and so on. We start seeing public mobilization in a way we haven't seen for a long time. We also saw that during COP15. We saw it during the war in.
Thank you. In the war in Iraq and so forth. Social media start playing a big role in terms of how we mobilize people. Many of them are using Twitter, they're using Facebook and so forth. We also look at it from a point of view of basic supply chains. If you look at coffee production in Africa, you look at tea production in India, the kind of consumer policies we put in place in my country, Denmark, or in the US or EU, will have direct implications on the working conditions and people in Africa and India, but they have zero voice. They can't tell that they don't like these chemicals and so forth. The last example may be the oil spill. The oil spill in the US. So if you look at it objectively, who's going to be influenced most by the oil spill in the US and the Gulf? A guy living in, or girl living in California, or me living in Denmark where the Gulf Stream is passing by. If I'm living in California and I vote on it, if I'm in Denmark and I want to influence that, I need to take an airplane to the southern part of the US and I need to volunteer on the beach, more or less. That's what I can do. That doesn't really happen, right? So what we're seeing right now is that there's a lot of global issues we can't resolve. And the Westphalian nation state, where you say certain people have decision-making power and other ones don't, is start getting into trouble now. And I'll give you some examples of how democracy right now is being challenged fundamentally. And I think we've seen the results, which is no political leadership to a large extent and no political solutions that are solving the issues. So if you look at the different kind of democratic states we have in the world, we have the Western mature democracies. How can we characterize them today? Well, look upon them. Around 25% of the American population votes for the American president. Around 30 to 40% of the European population vote for the European Parliament. We are seeing that basic democratic tools are not being used. When was the last time any of you guys went to a demonstration? When was the last time any of you guys wrote a piece in the newspaper? You probably don't. You're too busy with other things. So the democratic system doesn't work in many of the Western countries today. We're seeing populism. We're seeing media that are going to become tabloids. We are not able to really resolve some of the fundamental democratic issues. If you look at emerging democracies like Nigeria, like India, they're fundamentally challenged as well. So many of those countries, very large proportions of the population are illiterate. They can't read. You're seeing many of them being marginalized. You're seeing in certain of these countries you can buy your vote. You're seeing in certain of these countries there's no transparency in terms of what resources are being used for, etc., etc. What is the national bird in Nigeria? Eagle. What eagle? The super eagle. Okay. Let's say we have the super eagle. And what happens is that the super eagle unfortunately start getting extinct. So there's only 5 super eagles back in the world. Now I'm fortunate that I was just announced mayor of Lagos yesterday. So I'm sitting there thinking, 5 birds, and then an offer from the local supermarket chain, let's say it's Walmart coming into Nigeria, saying we will build a supermarket, 200 jobs, a lot of economic activity, but we want that piece of land right there. If I'm a mayor, what do you think I should choose? 5 birds or 200 jobs and a lot of economic activity? Probably a no-brainer, right? What if I tell you there's 100 million people out there in the world that love birds, are passionate about birds, and saying, maybe 10 million of them, 5 million of them, saying, those birds are actually important to us. And as social entrepreneurs say, I'm willing to build a little hotel, I will build a little park around it, if you guys sign up and say you're coming to Nigeria. What happens is, we create a policy alternative. Before, it didn't exist, because we were thinking, local government, only Nigerians, local money, local ideas. But if you start to flip it around and saying, well, look from a stakeholder point of view. There are global stakeholders out there. Then maybe in Hawaii, somebody could have done similar things, and they want to share their information about how they did it. Maybe the people that say we pay $2 and you make a mass collection. You create an opportunity that didn't exist before, because you brought in the people that felt they were real stakeholders to the issue. It's a bit like me with the golf. I start feeling I had a bigger share in this issue, but I was just excluded from the process. And if you look at local governments today, and we make 100, 200 standard solutions out there and say, these are typical decisions that's going to happen in local government. Something about building a school, building a local road, putting in water, whatever. How many of those standard decisions cannot be taken elsewhere in the world at a certain point in time? Probably all of them. But we don't learn. We actually don't know in Lagos what they've done in Accra a few months ago on the same issue. We don't know what happened in Alaska, we don't know what in Australia. But there's plenty of information and resources and ideas that we're not tapped into today. And the reason is that we're looking upon the world still in pyramids that are not connected. But in reality they are connected to the bottom, we haven't connected them yet. And that's what I think needs to happen in the future. So I'll give you another example. So let's say that in the Philippines there's a big corruption issue. And the government is considering introducing a new legislation around corruption. And there's certain people against, some people are for. At the end of the day, this decision, however, is in between politicians. But what if I start reframing that issue and saying, the Philippines is only one place where there's corruption, but there's many other places that are corruption. And we should focus on the Philippines to help them getting it right, so they can be a role model for all other countries. So that was my last comment in terms of things that will shape the world. I hope you thought it was useful, and I thank you again for the opportunity to speak.